Hey, Stephen, welcome to our Impact Coffee. We were very longing to have you here because you are everything in one person. You are a practitioner of social impact investing. You know very well the government and administration and how the things are going in Europe. And before, you've been also in the dark side of the economy, just doing normal business, being very successful. So I want you to share with us the whole story. So if you can briefly just introduce yourself in terms of explaining us everything about your former business, that you were an entrepreneur, you were very successful, what were the keys, and then just go to your path to social. How is this path? What grows your brain, your heart, your how does it happen? And
Yeah.
then I will get deeper in your actual job.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's a delight and a pleasure, really, Maria, to talk to you. Yes, I might have a dark side. You might discover at the end of the talks. I'll be open about it because I think we're still all together on a learning journey. So yeah, I'll share, let's say, my do's and don'ts and where I got it wrong and where potentially we see a way forward. So starting with a very quick introduction on myself. Yes, I started my own business so many years ago, which was focused on strategy advice on supply chain and operations, working for the big companies, food, pharma, all those kind of companies. And we grew it into a business of about 100 consultants with offices in Europe and US. But I have to say, that since 2000, there was something in the back of my mind, a little bit nagging, talking to the customers, Nike, food companies, Unilever. I saw there was a change in dialogue. And when we sold the business to Indians in 2008, I decided to switch career and go to the US for 1 year and see how social entrepreneurs were kind of dealing with social challenges in an entrepreneurial way. And that's when I joined Ashoka and the executive team of Ashoka, and helped them out with my knowledge on corporates, but at the same time learning a lot about social entrepreneurs. And when I came back to Europe in 2012, 2013, I started multiple initiatives. So I'm still an entrepreneur. I still started 2 businesses where business and social hopefully come together. I'm an investor, so I'm an active investor directly or indirectly into funds. And I'm also kind of playing a certain role in building the ecosystem, being the chair of EVPA and UK NAB.
So many things in this little body.
Yes.
Okay, I would like to know better. Later, we will go deeper into EVPA, which I really like. But tell us a little bit more about these 2 funds. You are in the board. You are in an international social impact fund, and you're a board member and also an investment committee member. And this one in Europe. And if you can share with us the difference of the impact you are getting or the funds are getting working in frontier or very poor countries, let's say, and working in Europe. Because for us, it's always a question of, we always thought we get more impact in Africa or Latin America than in Europe. But probably this is not very real. So I would really like to have your point of view as a practitioner in both markets.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very interesting. And to share you a bit of perspective about developing countries and developed countries, when I was still with Ashoka in US, my first job was to figure out where Ashoka could grow throughout the world in social entrepreneurship. And what I discovered, for example, is that in countries, Scandinavian countries or countries like Japan, it was very hard to get the notion of social entrepreneurship because government was taking such a big position in this whole social challenge and this support and definition of solutions. And I think the biggest difference between developing countries and developed countries, and then I come back to the two funds, is that in Africa, there is little infrastructure. So you have to be aware that any investment, there is this potential that the infrastructure, whether it's physical infrastructure or governmental infrastructure or juridical infrastructure, sometimes is not available. Markets might be informal. Tickets are pretty small. Campani is giving tickets of 100,000 to 500,000. Now we go beyond 500,000 to 1 million, so the missing middle. So the cost to run a fund for smaller tickets is much higher. So the big difference for me is that the risk on the one hand is higher and the cost is higher in developing countries. And it's very hard to run a fund with investments in the south, in developing countries, when you're too far away. So you have to be very close to manage those risks and manage those costs. But you're right, there are social challenges both in developing countries and developed countries. So what I see is that in developed countries, when we started with SI2 about 10 years ago, we were the first fund in the Benelux. And we took a very generic approach because impact investing was not very well known. One element that shows that this market is maturing is that nowadays, Maria, we see many more thematic funds because we see that those funds are specializing. And SI2 is now setting up SI3, the next fund, and rather than being generic, they are going to specialize under a certain social challenge. So that specialization is something I've seen changing. But then again, which is similar to both areas, is if you're a social first fund, what we call investors for impact in the EVPA language, also a learning is that only focusing on the transaction, the financial transaction, both in developed countries and developing countries, is not going to do the trick. I also see, and I'm a big advocate, that also in developed countries, that your financial investment should come together with other actors like grant makers, government, foundations, that also de-risk your deal in developed countries, or build an ecosystem, or build a constituency so that your social enterprise can thrive, whether it's in health or whether it's access to the labor market. But you cannot put the burden of building an ecosystem and building infrastructure all on a social enterprise by itself. And embedding your investments into this bigger picture is something which I very much like, but I also think is very much needed in both markets.
Yeah, in both. And then we can come to the EVPA, because I think it was created because the people that found it were seeing that this was a need in Europe, throughout Europe. But please tell us a little bit if, I don't know whether you were there at the very beginning, I guess no, but how it was originated, what were the goals you were having, what have you already achieved, and what can we expect for the future?
Yeah. No, I wasn't there. I was still too young, probably, and
That's what I thought.
at that time, I even didn't know such things existed, honestly, Maria. No, it were a couple of people from the VC market, venture capital market, that had the same questions as we have today. Can we not apply the rigor and some of the thinking of the VC market into the philanthropy market? Hence, they called it venture philanthropy. And that evolved over time from venture philanthropy into impact investing. But it's engaged grant giving, it's socially driven investments, and so on and so forth. I think that the first 10 years took a while before even the questions: what is this venture philanthropy? What is this impact investing? Why should we do this? Is this not something which is always going to be marginal and let's say little and small, or has this the potential to grow over time? I think the first 10 to 15 years we were dealing with the questions, what is it and why are we doing this? What I've seen over the last 5 years, that the question has changed. The question, what is it, is answered, and we still have questions to go deeper. Why are we doing this? I never get this question anymore. Everybody is aware that we should do something about the planet, the environment, social issues, and so on and so forth. But the big debate is now, how are we going to do this? How are we going to do it to make it sustainable and scalable? And so EVP as well has to follow this trend, where the first 10, 15 years we had to advocate, make visible the instruments of impact measurement, tell how this works and what are do's and don'ts. Nowadays, we have to go much more into the action. As EVPA, we have to think, first of all, how can we drive impact? When is impact realized by grant money? For certain social challenges, which are more public goods, we need those catalytic grants and disengaged grant giving. For other type of social challenges where you talk about, for example, the distance to the labor market and labor integration and skills, you see that hybrid kind of capital is coming together, commercial capital with some also social capital is coming together. So EVPA has now much more than ever before to distinguish what types of resources, financial and non-financial resources, are needed to address which kinds of capital. And when is a market approach appropriate? When is a governmental approach appropriate? Because we want to scale it through government or through the market. And this kind of thinking now will take EVPA in the next stage, which should be much more impact and solution driven.
I really like what you said. Yeah, we are badly needing that. So the foundations that are members of the EVP are longing for all this action.
Yeah, and it's a way to go. And what I see happening, Maria, and I think you will recognize that. When I started this 10 years ago, honestly, it was a leap of belief. When I was in the US and learning and talking about it, many times I was questioning whether I was talking bullshit or on the right track, or it was a daydream or a nightmare, I don't know. But at least I was not sure about what I was doing. But what I've seen gradually on different fronts is that high net worth individuals or family offices with their assets under management, they become more sophisticated. They have individuals that care for society, but they also have their family assets, which they normally manage in a traditional way. They start to question that because it's strange that the left hand is doing one thing and the right hand is doing another thing. So you start to see that the discussion on blending doing good and doing business, getting impact and getting financial return, is a question which in family offices nowadays is very vibrant. The same in foundations. Again, it's a bit strange and maybe even sometimes schizophrenic that on the one hand you have 100 millions or sometimes billions assets under management in your endowment, and on the other hand you have a grant making facility that tries to make up for maybe what the endowment is doing on the other hand. So they start to collaborate and think together as well. And the same happens with, and maybe that's a next topic we can touch upon, the same is happening with corporations and corporate foundations.
Yeah, I really wanted to ask you about, because we all read your article on corporate foundation and social impact. How do you call them? The
corporate social investment.
Social, exactly. Yeah. So can you develop a little bit more for us your ideas that you share in this document, and then I know that it has been evolved since then.
Yeah, it is very much as I said. It's not a standalone kind of movement. It's embedded in a bigger movement where the doing good and the doing business, or the impact return and the financial return, are seeking complementarity. And it's a bit weird. I remember one of the first foundations I was talking to, the Nike Foundation and the Siemens Foundation. When I asked them what was the initial idea to set up a foundation, they told me that in the late last century, Nike had this big scam about child labor, you might remember, which was going out, and they had to make up for this. Siemens had also a pretty big financial bribery scandal in 2007, 2008, and so on and so forth. So this wasn't a wake-up call for them, and said, wow, society is coming back on us. We have to do something. Let's start a foundation. Without much thought and much kind of ideas why and how to do this, apart from we have to make up for something the right hand is doing apparently wrong to society. But it's weird again that a foundation should only be there to make up for what the company is doing or not doing. So you can do much more if you start to align on a common dot on the horizon, which we call purpose. And both for the foundation, you can accelerate impact, and for business, you can accelerate inclusiveness if you start to collaborate. And what EVPA did is, with their 60, 70 corporate members, we started to analyze how can you reinforce each other, how to align. And we distinguished 4 different types of alignment. First alignment is what we call non-material alignment, which means you're working together, each with their own strategy. You align on a purpose, but you leave each other the room and the space to act separately. But you come together, for example, on a geographical focus. The Shell Foundation and the GTI, the Japanese Tobacco Industry Foundation, they say we only act in a space, in a geography where our corporation is active. So we can leverage the language, access to government, employees, vehicles, very material, practical stuff if we have to do something on the ground, but not very strategic, very operational. That's what we call a non-material alignment. Then we see, that's the second type of definition, corporate foundations that start to align a bit more, like the Trafigura Foundation, which is dealing with commodities, trading, and I think all of you know that the vessels on the sea, the ships, are also a big source of CO2 emission. So they started to think, as a Trafigura Foundation, can we do not something around CO2 emission of the maritime vehicles, the maritime transportation, because it's relevant for the business and it's relevant for the planet. So let's align. We can source knowledge, we can source ideas, we can source networks from the company, but we want to go beyond the company. We want to address a thematic issue which is relevant for us, creating CO2 reduction, and for the company. The third type of alignment is a very ambitious type of alignment where, for example, fashion, fair fashion, fashion for good came together, and where corporate foundations of a lot of fashion players like Inditex in Spain and CNA Foundation and Puma and so on and so forth came together and said, we have to move the needle for the industry. It's very hard to expect the industry itself to move the needle in 5 to 10 years, but we can work together. We do not compete as corporate foundations. We can work together. We can take with our bold capital a long-term view, and we, for example, can invest in organic cotton. We can invest in a fair and sustainable supply chain for women's rights and children's rights. Each and every company, if they would embark on this journey, would feel it maybe in the short term as a competitive disadvantage. Because in the short term, it requires investments. It requires to take a big step. So corporate foundations can come together and move the needle on the industry level. That's what we call industry alignment. And the last type of alignment, when the corporate foundation even comes closer to the supply chain of the business, is when, for example, the corporation is looking into a fair and sustainable supply chain for their individual supply chain. How can social entrepreneurs help to also source in a fair way, how to also make sure that there is transparency in the supply chain, and so on and so forth. Of course, the question that then pops up is whether it's still a foundation or a different type of structure that should come so close to the corporation, and when is CSR and corporate citizenship taking over. And that, Maria, is where we see nowadays Repsol started already some time ago next to the corporate foundation, a corporate accelerator to source for social enterprises that do something with renewable energy, or a corporate impact fund. Philips very recently also announced that the Philips Foundation is starting as well a corporate impact fund to source innovations in healthcare, access to last mile healthcare. IKEA started IKEA Social Entrepreneurs because they want to make sure that there is a regenerative economy and that social entrepreneurs can also provide access to these kind of innovations for the supply chain of the company. So you see that if you want to align with the long-term sustainability goal of the company, the foundation can do something, but other structures can do something as well.
This is so good. I read your article, and every time I revisit it, because we are trying to give this awareness to corporate foundations here in Spain. But here we have a real problem, and it is that some of them have a Chinese wall between the corporation and the foundation. Because like traditionally here, foundations were used for tax evasion purposes. So normally the regulation doesn't allow a foundation, a corporate foundation, to get very close to the business of the corporation, because maybe you are trying to open a new business that you don't do in the corporation because you are. So this is being like slowly being broken, but we are still struggling because of the way the corporate foundations were built. And in following with your line of thought, in which you say, okay, the first corporate foundations were founded down in the early maybe 2000s, when they were discovering that they were damaging whatever, human rights, the environment, and they decided to, let's build a foundation to forgive our sins. And this is still in here. So with the foundation, we can only do good in a way of traditional granting to vulnerable children, and I don't know, feeding people. Well, and this is proving very difficult to change in Spain. I think they're working that way. That's why it's so good, the effort the EVPA is doing in putting all the examples around Europe together, teaching about it, investing resources and energy in trying to move this corporation towards this way, because I see the asset management sector, the financial sector, is already moving at least to the environment and more clean investments, because it's a trend now. There is regulation, they badly need to do it. So it's easy for us as impact investors to open conversations with them, convince them to put more money maybe in the social or the governance or whatever, or gender lens. They're open to have these discussions. But with corporations, it's still very difficult. I think they need to be the next ones. But just coming back a little bit more to the work of other foundations, not corporate ones, and the tremendous work that the EVPA is doing, like developing and helping role models to tell their story, to share with everyone. Because this venture philanthropy concept is still difficult for foundations. I have discussions in the way of, yes, but if I invest, maybe I will lose the money. Yeah, but you're losing it every year. You're granting projects. So at the end of the day, if you lose the money, you have granted a project, which was not a non-for-profit, a profit project, but at the end you will be helping these people. So I read about these 3 dimensions of venture philanthropy that you explained very well, and I would like to hear you in a small and simple explanation of what is venture philanthropy and why foundations need to start exploring at least?
Yeah, it's an intriguing question, and I think it's a very, very important question, because without foundations, I'm convinced that we will not shift the needle to the extent we want. So we have to keep them or take them on board. And the way I try to think about it, Maria, is very much like, look, if you give a grant, that's great. You feel good and you address something. So I'm not against giving grants, on the contrary. But I think that if you really want to feel responsible about your grant, you want to see the effect of your grant. So you want to see not only that you give the money and that they promise you something, you want to see what is it precisely what you promise me? Where are you going to make the difference? What additional impact are you going to deliver? And will you then afterwards measure that impact and will you tell me then not only what you did with the grant, because that's good, but I would like to see how effective were you in providing the grant, in creating impact. And that's where engaged grant giving or venture philanthropy comes in. Venture philanthropy goes beyond I give money, and probably that's fine and that's great and that's feeling good, but the effectiveness of the giving is questioned, positively questioned. Can you show your additionality, your impact additionality? Do you manage and measure your impact like any good organization should do, that they manage not only their outputs, I've teach so many children, but also what did it change in the children? Did it bring them out of poverty, or did it create more learning in their capacity in their learning brain? So that's the outcomes. And finally, impact is very difficult to measure, but at least outcomes. That's where we have to move the needle. I think that's one thing. The second thing where foundations play a very important role is that more and more there are still fragile spaces. In moving the needle in microfinance, once I read somewhere we spent, Maria, billions of money before the whole market of microfinance became an asset class and a mature market. There are still fragile markets like small-scale farming in the South, we discussed it, social housing in Europe, preventive health care for underserved populations. There as well, we have to realize, if we want to solve it at scale, that de-risking and bringing in big capital will require that also catalytic capital comes in first. Because catalytic capital can keep the promise of creating impact, but at the same time accelerate the impact that will be generated by the more commercial capital. So a second step, which C3 in US, MacArthur Foundation, and so on and so forth is kind of creating, is a second kind of area for foundations. And the third thing where we have too little capital nowadays coming from foundations is we need bold and daring capital to build what I call this larger infrastructure where social innovation can thrive. If the basic infrastructure is not available, and when I say infrastructure, is both physical and non-physical infrastructure. It's legislation, it's access to data, it's making sure that the different pieces of the puzzle come together. Otherwise, many social enterprises get stuck in a very narrow, short-term transactional enterprise. And we all know, as I said in the beginning, if the legal setting is not right, if the financial structure is not right, if access to people is not available, then it's very hard for an enterprise to thrive. And that's where foundations also have to, even if they focus on certain topics, they should be more brave and bold to sometimes provide money to create a good context, a flourishing context where the individual social enterprise can thrive.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that these are reasons enough for foundations to, of course, join the EVPA and try to start doing small things here and there, very related to their mission. So, those were my questions for today. I don't know whether you want to add something.
Not really. I think you covered a lot of things. Maybe one final thought that crosses my mind and where I struggle a lot, Maria, is look, as entrepreneurs, I know you a little bit, I know myself a little bit. We're all very impatient. And it's frustrating to see how little we manage to get done in the short term. If you look 3, 4, 5 years, it's frustrating. But to end with a positive note, if I go back and I look when I entered the space 10 years ago, at that time, when we were talking about impact investing or sustainability, very little people even did understand what I was talking about. Nowadays, moving from the question why and what is it to how are we going to do this is already a big step forward. So I think that balancing short-term action with long-term perspective, where creating impact and also getting market traction and also addressing the public good, I think that's where we should find a good fine line and make progress.
Thank you. This is very hopeful. And the only thing that we need is to be patient a little bit. Okay. Thank you very much for your time, Steven, and hope to see you soon.
My pleasure, Maria.